Hello everyone, in this module we will be learning about JavaScript. JavaScript was initially created to make web pages alive. JavaScript is a scripting or a programming language that allows you to implement complex functions on web pages. Every time a web page does more than just sitting there and displaying static information, you can bet that JavaScript is probably working in background. JavaScript is a programming language for the web, like C++ is for low latency systems where precision and high speed are very important. Like Python is for backend on servers. Similarly, we have JavaScript for the web pages. JavaScript can update and change both HTML and CSS present on a web page. Like we have a dark mode in YouTube. In just one click, we can change the style of whole page. JavaScript can calculate, manipulate, and validate data. Like when we try to log into our account and the website needs to know if the password entered is correct or not. Let's get into more details about JavaScript and the data variables in the JavaScript. Let's start by looking different type of variables in a JavaScript. To manipulate data on website, we need to know how many data types are in JavaScript first. So we have a string variable in a JavaScript which can store the whole string as a piece of information. The another is a number variable which can take any form of number. It can either be a float or an integer. And to process the Boolean logic, we can save data as true or false inside a Boolean variable. And operators, there is something special in them. They are just a function that can take one or more argument and produce a value at the same point. Like simple addition and subtractions are example of these type of operators. So these are the types of variables. Now we need to save a variable with some name so that we can call that name to use later in our code. To do that, we need to write var then the name of that variable equals to some value. This value can be any form of the data type we just looked above. What is an array and why do we need them? An array is a special variable which can hold more than one value at a time. Imagine we need to store names of all the students in our classroom. One way is to make a variable var student1 equals to name of the student1 and do this for 50 times. Or we can make a list of a student by saying var students equals to an array which contains the name of all the students. Then to know the name of the nth student, suppose 10th student, we can call students 9 as the count in an array starts from 0 in JavaScript. Very often when you write a code, you want to perform different actions for different decisions. You can use conditional statement in your code to do this. In JavaScript, we have the following conditional statement. Use if to perform a block of code to be executed if a specific condition is true. Use else to perform a code if the specific condition is false. Use else if to specify a new condition to test if the first condition is false. Furthermore, let's talk about objects in JavaScript. Objects are variables too, but objects can contain many values. Objects help to collect information together and pass it on to the code. Within the object, we save the variable using key value pair. For example, let's create an object person. We write var person equals to curly bracket. Then the first key is first name and the value is given John. Second key is last name and the value is Doe. Similarly, another key is age and the value is 50. And another key is eye color and the value is blue. Another example we can take is var course equals to within the curly bracket. Within the name key, we have JavaScript. With the start key, we have 6. And with the end key, we have 8. Now we can access the data in object in two ways. First is course.name. This will give the result as a JavaScript. Or we can use course within the square bracket. We can specify the key which we are looking for. Here in example, we have written course within the curly bracket, within the square brackets, we have given key as name. So the value we get is JavaScript. We make functions when we know that we are going to use some piece of code again and again in code. So to not just copy paste code every time, we can make functions. And to write these functions in JavaScript, we need to use function keyword, then the name of a function along with parentheses, then a curly bracket. Within these parentheses, we can give parameters for code inside the function. And the function ends when it reaches return keyword inside the code. And with this return, we can pass the variable to our main code. There are more ways to define a function in JavaScript. The first one is the anonymous function way. Here, from the definition above, as we used var, then the name of the variable, in this case we are using big number, then we are giving a value which is actually a function. We use function keyword along with the parentheses, then within the square brackets we have used variable a which is 2 and variable b which is 3. Then we have an if and else condition which says if a is greater than b, then return a, else return b. As we know, a is less than b, so else condition will be true and the returning value will be 3. Hence, at the end, we are trying to print the value or the returning value from this function. That's why we have used big number along with the parentheses, because big number is now the name of the function, and to call a function we must have a parentheses. Where on right hand side we have immediately invoke function expression. In a similar way, we have defined var big number equals to function within a parentheses then a square curly brackets. The only difference is that now this whole thing is inside a parentheses and end we have a couple more parentheses. What it does is it executes the function at the same point it is being defined. So the big number is not a function anymore, rather it will take the final value. In this case, the value of b will be the value saved in a big number, which is equals to 3. So both these functions will print the same number, but the only difference is that the left one is a function and the right one is a value. JavaScript is an interpreter language. This means we do not have to compile the JavaScript source code before sending it to the compiler. An interpreter can take a raw JavaScript code and run it for you. And the browser is nothing but a JavaScript interpreter, so we can run JavaScript directly onto the browser. Let's see with an example. We will run a JavaScript Chrome code on a Chrome. This is an empty web page. To go to the JavaScript settings, we first need to go to Developer menu. To do that, we click on Inspect menu. You get terminal something like this. In these options, we must choose console. We can cross this. This is a place where you can run the JavaScript and it will run directly into the Chrome browser. First thing we can do is write the variables we just studied right now, like variable name, and this can be hello world. And to print the variable in the console, we need to write console.log and the name of the variable. We have got hello world output. Let's try variable age equals to 21. Now try to print this in our console. Name of the variable age. We have got the number 21. Let's try some variables and add some operator on it. Like variable a is 10, variable b is 20, then a variable c is equals to a plus b. And what is the value of a and plus b will go to the c. And to check that, we can use console.log and print the value of c, as it should be 30 and it is 30. Let us write some function. So to write a function, we just have studied that we need to specify the function keyword. Then a name of function like add. We can use two variables, then a curly bracket, and we can return plus a plus b here. Then we close the curly bracket. Now, whenever we want to use this add function, we can directly call it using the name add. Like variable c will have an add value which can be 20, 20. Now, to confirm that the value of c is 40, we print it on the console using console.log, and we have got the value to be 40. As we studied, there are more ways to define a function. So one way was to use an expression. Let's use a variable and use a subtract variable name and define a function here. Within the parentheses, we have to give the variables a, b. Within the curly brackets, we must write the code. Here, it can be a minus b. Then end the curly bracket. Now the variable name sb will run the function. We can verify that using variable c equals to sb and say 10, 5. Now print the value of c. We must get 5 and it is 5. We also learned about immediately invoked functions. So let us try to create that. We can do that using our variable c, then Starting with the parentheses, we need to define a function. Now, the function must not take any variables inside it, as in the end it will be a value. So next we start with a curly bracket. We define a variable a equals to 10, then a variable b equals to 30, then we return a into b. Then we close the curly bracket and we close the another parentheses. And now to invoke this, we again use a parentheses. Now let's check what is a C. As it should have been, the C is a number because we returned the number and it was immediately invoke function. That's why the value of C is now 600. Document Object Model, or in short, DOM. When a web page is loaded, the browser creates a document object model of the page. This is like a tree, having a root and the branches. In this case, we have a document as a root. Then further, the first branch is HTML element. Then the further tree divides into head and a body. Then further, all the things which appear on a page are divided in the body. With this DOM model, now JavaScript gets more powerful. It can make the page dynamic now. It can change all the HTML elements inside the page and can even change the HTML attributes on the page. The HTML DOM is a standard for how to get, change, add, or delete HTML elements. Let's see how we can do that. With DOM, we can change the property of HTML elements. Elements are elements inside the HTML page. It can either be title or a body or h1 tag inside a body, anything present on the page. The dot inner HTML is a property of that element which contains the content for the element which we can assign or change or update with the help of a JavaScript code. With the help of DOM, we can change the attribute of the image tag. We can also change the style properties of an element. Like we can change the color of a text. Methods in the DOM are ways to search for elements in a web page. Document is a whole HTML document, and in that we want to search for some element. We can do this by using getElementById method, or we can use getElementByClass method. On the whole document element, we can use these two methods to search the whole page for an element which ID we can provide as a parameter, or a class we can provide as a parameter, and in return we will get that element. Further, we can use DOM to add or even delete elements currently present on a page. To do that, we need to first do is we need a document, then we have a method called createElement. Within this createElement method, we want to give the element which we want to create inside the document. Document.removeChild and document.appendChild will take the element and will remove and append accordingly. Let us see in a blank page and with the help of a terminal, try to understand what a DOM is. Again, we will go to inspect properties. There we'll use a console and as we know, this is currently blank page right now. There's nothing on a page. So why not let's try to create an element inside this page. Let's try to add heading to this blank page. We can do this by creating an h1 element and changing its inner property, then appending it to the blank page. First thing is we need to create a variable. We can name it heading and this can be equal to document dot create element and the name of the element is h1 because we are giving heading. Now heading is an h1 element. We can see this by printing heading. It is currently blank now because we have just defined the element. We haven't given any content inside the element. Let's give some content inside the element. We can do this by selecting the element, then inner changing its property using inner HTML and making it equal to hello world. Now say running this code. Now again checking what is inside the heading element. As we can see, the hello word got inserted as an content inside the h1 element. Our heading is ready. Now let's insert this heading variable or element inside our document. We can do that using document.append child. So document with a method append child and we have given variable which contains the element h1 element. Now run it. As you can see, there is some error. It is because the document can only have one child. We cannot give document two childs. Document can only have HTML as a child. That's why whenever you want to append something, we need to append it inside the body. So what we want to do is we want document dot body dot append child. Then we give heading. As you can see, the hello world is now being printed on our web page. We started with a blank web page and we have got heading onto this blank page. We can see the code in the element section here. And if we can see within the body, there's h1 element with the hello world content. This is exactly what we wanted and we did not write any HTML code. We did this using JavaScript and with the help of DOM. What are DOM events? A JavaScript can be executed when an event occurs inside an HTML page. These events are called DOM events. Let's have an example. H1, then we have an attribute on click and inside this on click attribute, we have written a JavaScript code which says this dot inner HTML equals to you clicked. Then within the h1 tag, we have given the element content as please click. So what it does is when the H1 element is clicked, the JavaScript code will run which says change the inner HTML of this element to you clicked. So earlier the element content was please click. Now after the JavaScript will run, it will say you clicked. So what the user will see is that whenever it clicks on a please click H1 heading, the heading will change to you clicked. This click is a DOM event. There are many other DOM events like this, like when a web page has been loaded. You can imagine the use case of this. Whenever the YouTube video is loading, you can see the loading sign. This is where the DOM event is happening. The other event is like when a mouse hovers over an element. You can again imagine it using an example. Whenever you hover over a Netflix card or the movie which you want to see, the movie pops up and starts playing. This is on mouse hover element or the attribute is being run there. What are event listeners now? Listener is nothing but a function, a JavaScript function. The add event listener method attaches an listener to the specified element. For example, we have written document get element by ID, then we have written my button, which will give one element which will be of ID my button. And on in that element, we have added an add event listener. Within this add event listener, we have given two parameters. One is click and a second one is display date. The click is the event which we want it to be run on, and the display date is nothing but a JavaScript function. It's the name of the JavaScript function. So whenever my button element will get click, the display date function must run. This is what the event listener does. Browser object model or BOM. It is similar to what we have just learned, the document object model. Just the difference is that the browser object models allows JavaScript to talk to the browser, whereas in a DOM, the JavaScript was only able to talk with the tab. With tab, I mean with the whole HTML page on that particular tab. Whereas in BOM, we can write a JavaScript code to even open another tab and do something there. And the best cases to use this is to resize the current window according to the device. But note that CSS does this faster than a JS. So it's better to use CSS in place of resizing the window. Let's try to run the BOM codes into our console and we'll see what it does. Again, we go to inspect, then within the console, we write window.open. We can specify the URL https://www.google.com. What it does is it takes a new browser and runs the URL there. Similarly, we can open a new tab here and we can say window, which means the current tab, then close. It closed the page or the tab which was open. This is the power of BOM. We can use it to resize the window and we can open another tab in this. Asynchronous JavaScript and XML, in short AJAX. Ajax is not a programming language. Ajax just uses a combination of a built-in XML HTTP request object and HTML DOM with the help of JavaScript to display data on a website dynamically. Ajax can send data to a server in the background. Ajax can receive data from a server after the page has been loaded. Ajax can update a web page without even reloading the whole page. Let's see how Ajax can do all of this with the help of some code. On the left, we have a very simple HTML page in which we have a division which is of ID demo. In this division, we have an H2 heading which says let Ajax change this text. Then we have a button which is of type button, and we have an DOM event attached to it which says on click equals to load doc. Load doc must be a JavaScript function then. On the right, we have defined the load doc function. Here we are using an XML HTTP request object. The XML HTTP request is used to exchange data with the server. It is the built-in browser facility. And with the new keyword, we are creating an object of it with the name XHTTP. Further, we have said XHTTP dot onReady state chain equals to some function. This is the function which we define that what to do when we receive the data from a server. We have given that the data, whatever we receive, should replace the inner HTML of the division with the ID demo. Further in code, we have defined a URL which is a URL of Autonise AI GitHub API. If you go on to this URL, you will see some details about our Autonise AI GitHub page. Now, what should happen is we want that detail on our web page whenever we click that button. So let's create a GET request. We will use an xhttp.open. In this, the method we want to use is get method, then the URL, and the true specifies that the Ajax is actually asynchronous mode. We have made this connection. Now send a request with the help of xhttp.send. Let's try to run this code and understand how Ajax is actually asynchronous. This is the output from the code we just studied. As we expected, whenever we click on this button, it should load the details which are present on that URL. As you can see, we have got a login to be of Autonise AI. Hence, the code is working. Let's try to understand how this code is actually asynchronous. To do that, let's open an inspect panel and go to our console, and we will try to print some details in our JavaScript function to understand how it is actually asynchronous. As we know, the JavaScript runs line by line. So let's try to understand which line is getting printed. Let's print the order in which the code is being executed with the help of console.log. This is the first line which will get executed. Then after it opens a connection, the second line will get executed. After it sends a connection, the code goes inside the function. So this is actually the third line which should get executed. Then after it sends the connection, the fourth line should get executed. Let's save this and run this. And whenever we click on the change content, this function will run again. As you saw, the order is not the one we expected. It is because the code is asynchronous. It's now not running line by line. So the order in which our code ran was first it sends 1, then to 2, then 4. The xhttp.send is actually sending the request to the server, and onReady state change is actually working whenever it accepts the incoming data. That's why the code ran from here 1, then 2, then 4, and whenever we received the data, the log was we got the output to be 3. And in this way, we can send as many requests as we want, and the code will be asynchronous.
We're building a real-time calculator on a web page. So we'll apply all the things which we have learned till now, including HTML, CSS, Bootstrap, and JavaScript. So let's get started. So this is the fun part. I believe that how much ever you learn the theory, it's best to get a hands-on practice of the things you learn, because then personally I don't forget stuff if I have practiced it a bit. So I've removed everything that was in the body. Let's change the title to creating our own calculator. Let's refresh this. Yeah. So I'll just give you an example of how our calculator is going to look. So let's say I type in here 10 plus 15 and I press equal to, then I'm getting the value over here. I can also press on these buttons and it shows me the history of the calculation as well as the results in this box over here. So we are going to build this using Bootstrap and JavaScript. So let's get started. First of all, what we'll do is we'll create the basic outline of the HTML without adding any functionality or JavaScript to it. So first of all, I'll create a container and I'll add a row to it. So this is the standard procedure. I always start with creating a container, then a row. In this case, what we want is that the calculator should not take the entire width of the container. It should take 50% and it should be centered. So to do that, so there are 12 imaginary columns. To take 50% means we'll be using 6 columns, and there are 3 columns which are invisible over here. So let's add those columns. Div class call. We'll be using a large column because if the calculator width gets too small on smaller screens, that won't look good. So you can see this calculator is better than having a very narrow calculator. So that's why we'll be using call LG instead of call MD, and we'll keep the 3 imaginary columns over here and we won't add any code to it. So this will create the offset that we require. Next, I'll create another call LG with 6 columns, and here we'll add all our code. Let's add a text center class as well so that all the text inside the calculator is center aligned. To make this card look good, I've also added a shadow to it. So we'll use the Bootstrap class shadow. Let's save this. So I'll refresh this. So as we have not added any content, so we don't see anything. So let's first create another row inside of this, which has the call as well. And there we write calculator. Yeah, so we have the calculator here, but let's add some margin on top of the container. So great, it looks good, but having a bit of a padding on the top would make it look even better. So to our row, let's add some uh, padding as well. Let's add it in the both the directions. Yeah, what we can do now is we can apply some styles to make the calculator look like this. So I have used the classes button and button primary to make the calculator look blue. So you can see now that the calculator is blue, but it's not taking the entire width. To make the calculator take the entire width of the column, let's create our own class named full width. So I'll create a style tag. I'll add the class full width, which will put the property of width to be 100%. Let's add it to this row. So now you can see that the calculator is taking the entire width of the row. Also, let's add some padding or margin on top of the calculator as well. Yeah, so now it looks better. Ours is a bit thicker, but that's fine. Next, let's create the text area where we'll be adding the history of our calculations. So let's create another row. Inside that, we have a column. We'll also add a margin of 3 in the y direction. And I guess you might have forgotten by now, but we also have an element in HTML named text area. So let's use that to add. Yeah, so you can see we have the text area. So let's add the full width class to this text area as well, so that it takes the entire width. Also, let's add a padding of 3 in all the directions of the text area. So this is how the text area looks. We can even type anything we want, but that's not possible over here. So we need to disable this text area. To do that, you just need to write read only attribute over here. And you can see the text area has now become ineditable. Next, let's add an ID to this because we'll be requiring it later on. And let's name it history. Also, there is an attribute named rows. So let's have our 4 rows in this text area. So you can see that the number of rows has increased. So we'll be able to see 4 rows in this text area. Also, let's add some content to this text area. So it's not visible. Just a moment. So whenever we add some content to the text area, by default, it will be center aligned because our parent class is center aligned. We want to make it right aligned as in this case. So let's add the class text right over here. So we can't actually see some text over here right now, but later on when we update the contents using JavaScript, just a moment. Yeah. So later on, when we'll be updating the contents using JavaScript, you'll be able to see the text in the right hand direction. So now that we have our text area as well, let's have a look at what other things which we require over here. So we need an input. So we are inputting some text over here. So we need to have an input element. So to do that, first of all, we'll need to create another row and break it down into two main columns, which will be further broken down into three columns. So let's start doing that. So div class row. So it will be broken down into two main columns. The first column would take 10 of the 12 imaginary columns. This will contain the input element of type text having the class full width so that it takes the entire width. Let's put the ID of this input as result, and that's it. An input tag does not have a slash input to close it. You don't need to close an input tag. So that's it. We have added the input. Let's have a look how this input looks like. So yeah, this input is now visible. Next. So what we need to do is we need to actually have multiple buttons below this input as well. So we'll need to create another row and a column and add the input inside of it. Yeah, it does not make any change right now, but we'll be adding multiple rows inside this column 10. So let's start adding those rows. Yeah, so it will have a column also. So just a second, this column would be of size 4. So if you just break this part down into 12 columns imaginary, each of the buttons takes 4 of the imaginary 12 columns. So this would be called 4. Next, let's create another row which has a column which has an input of type button having value equal to 1 and class full width. I hope everyone is able to understand exactly what is happening. So let's refresh it to see what happened. So using this code, we were able to add a button below the input to just add a bit of a, so there is no margin over here as well. So let's leave it out. So now we have one button. To replicate more buttons, you can just copy and paste this row below each other. And let's see. So yeah, now we have 4 buttons over here. What we want to do is we want to change its value to 1, 4, 7 and a dot. So that's it. Let's also add some padding below this. So to do that, we can just add a padding PB3 to the top column as well. So that did not work actually. I believe we need to add this padding to this column. And yeah, that works. So next, coming back to our code of creating the inputs, we were able to create one column. What I'll do is I'll just add all the other columns as well because that's a repetitive code. So I'll just copy this code and add these columns as well and the next columns. So you can see we have added all the further columns which were required inside this call 12. We have to yet complete the call 2 buttons. Also, you can see I have already assigned an on-click listener to these inputs. These, whenever this button is pressed, a function named dis is called with the value 6. So let's add these on-click event listeners to the ones which we created in the beginning as well. So when this button is pressed, we'll add, so we'll pass the value 1 to this. We'll add pass 4, we'll pass 7 and a dot. Yeah, so there is one special button in all of them, which is the equal to sign. So what should happen when we press equal to, then this expression should be evaluated. So we have a different function for this equal to sign, which is solve. So we have yet not defined the functions, but whenever this button is pressed, we'll be calling the solve function. So we have created our calculator's left hand side part. Let's create the remaining part as well. So I'll just copy the code. So let's find where the call 10 was present and just add this code after that. By the way, all of this code will be available to you so you can have a look at these codes to further understand how exactly the HTML part of this calculator has been written. So in this call to, you can see there's a C button which should clear the expressions which was written in the input button. So it has a different function. Next, on slash, the general function dis is called. Similarly for all the minus, plus and multiplication input buttons as well. So great, we have created the structure of the calculator, but when we click these buttons, nothing works. And you can see an error in the console saying this is not defined. So clear is not defined and so on. So let's start writing the logic part of this calculator. So for that, we need to add JavaScript code to script. So let's create a script tag. Inside this, first let's create the clear function. So in this function clear, what we want to do is we want to access this input element and put its inner HTML to blank. So we'll access our element by its ID, which was result, if you remember. So we have our input over here. Just a moment. Yeah. So we have the input over here, which has the ID result. So we'll get the element by its ID and set its value to blank. So if you want to change the value of an input, you need to access its value property. So let's see if this works. Let's write something, and when I press C, this input is now cleared. So great, the clear function seems to be working. Next, let's work on the dis function, which was called whenever we press these buttons. So you can see this is not defined. So let's first define this function. Next, so you can see a value is passed whenever the dis function is called. So we'll get that value using the argument. Next, what we want to do is inside result, we want to append whatever button we press. So to append, we can directly do plus equal to the value. This is just a short notation of writing value is equal to the current value plus the value which we got from the arguments. So the shorthand notation of writing this is just plus equal to. Let's see if these buttons work right now. So when I press 258, you can see these values are being passed over here and being appended to the value of result. So great, our calculator now seems to be working, but there is one catch. The equal to sign yet does not work because we have not written the solve function. So let's write the solve function as well. So great, we have defined the solve function. So let's first analyze what our solve function should do. It should evaluate this expression, whichever is present in this input, and then create a history of it in the text area. So to do that, first of all, we'll need to access the history. So let's create a var text area element and get it by document.getElement by ID history. So if we go back to our text area, yeah, you can see I have already provided it with an ID of history. So we have the text area element. Next, we need to get the expression in this input. So we can do that by document.getElement by ID result.value. So var, let's name it just x is equal to this value. Inside JavaScript, there is a really nice pre-built function written named eval. So we'll just use eval to evaluate the string which was present inside this input. You don't need to worry. Even I did not know about this function before taking the session. What I did was I searched on JavaScript on Google that is there a function which can evaluate a string expression, and it gave me the results. So whenever you feel that you want to do something, just first search it on Google if it is already present, and it will save you a lot of time. So now we have our results inside the y variable. What we need to do is we need to first clear the text present in the input. So to do that, we can just reuse our clear function. So we can clear the function by this command. Next, what we need to do is we need to write the results and the expression in the history. So text area element dot value is equal to text area element dot value plus x, which was the expression, plus equal to plus y, which was the result, and an enter. So those familiar with coding would know that slash n is for new line. Those who are not familiar, this is nothing but a cool way of writing enter. So that should add our text inside the history as well. Let's save this and see whether this works or not. So let's clear this. I'll write 2 plus 3 equal to, so yeah, you can see that we are getting our expression over here. So that's really great. We have built our own calculator. So yeah, it's working perfectly fine. So the basic idea was we spent a lot of time in building the exact structure of the HTML. We added some on-click event listeners, and then we binded them to the functions. In the functions, we wrote the logic that when clear is called, the result value should be made blank. Whenever this is called, the value should be appended to the input. Next, whenever solve is called, the text area should be cleared, its values should be evaluated, and they should be displayed in the text area element. So we can also reduce this code by doing a plus equal to, just like we did in the function dis. So if we do 3 plus 9 equal to, um, okay, it gave an error. So let's just revert back to the previous method. Let's clear it. So clear has stopped working. There seems to be some error. Yeah, so that's now solved. Yeah, so there was some caching error, because of which I was not able to get it work properly. I just did Control Shift R or a hard reload, and it's working perfectly fine now. So that's it. Um, I guess this is it about building a calculator. Also, if you notice, the calculator looks really nice even when you keep on decreasing the width of the window. It does not collapse. That's because of Bootstrap. It's being automatically responsive. And using JavaScript, you have already seen how we have added the logic. You can maybe style this a little better by adding some padding on top of these buttons, but you can do that. So that's left for you.